This encounter took place in a small town on the coast of Northern California. A friend and I decided that we wanted to grow a garden on his property. The trail to get there was a half a mile through some thick pine forest and huckleberry bushes. The garden itself was trellised on the hillside with a small man-made pond that we used to water the plants. My friend and I would ride our dirt bikes to check on it daily. One day in midsummer, we decided to camp there with another friend. My two friends pitched a tent, but being outdoorsy, I made a shelter underneath a fallen tree. I used the branches to close off the back and the sides, and I had a large branch for a door. I also had a blanket, knowing it would get chilly that night. Before going to bed, I had the thought to leave my riding boots on to protect against any would-be critters trying to get frisky. Mountain lions and the occasional bear are a thing, although they are rare. Better safe than sorry, I thought, keeping my feet toward the opening of the shelter. We talked about our day and what we had planned for the garden. The three of us fell asleep. I woke up sometime later to something heavy walking right next to my shelter. It shook the ground when it walked, as if it wanted to make a point and say that it was the biggest thing around. My immediate thought was that a big bear was rooting around the camp. That is, until I noticed it was walking on two legs. As if that wasn't alarming enough, it started looking into my shelter. I froze stiff and I could hear it breathing and sniffing as it made its way inside through the door that I had made. I had a big branch pulled in to block the door, but this thing didn't seem to care. I had a .303 rifle laying next to me, but the thought of protecting myself with it never crossed my mind. I was too stunned to move or think straight. The sniffing and probing went on for what felt like hours, and just when I thought it would finally back out and leave me be, I felt its giant hand grab my leg and tug on it, as if trying to see if I was a piece of wood or something else. And when it grabbed me, I screamed like a pack of stuck pigs. I must have scared it as bad as it scared me because it let out a high-pitched, horror-stricken scream, and it took off toward the woods, ripping the top off my buddy's tent along the way. Well, we were terrified. All three of us had heard and seen it. We stayed as quiet and as still as we could until the first light showed over the mountains, and then we got to our bikes. No sooner had I gotten to my bike and got it moving when a baseball-sized rock hit me in the side of the head, and it knocked me off my bike. My buddy behind me stopped and helped me back up, and we hightailed it out of there, and we never went back to that area again. Hey, welcome to the podcast. My name is Cameron Buckner. This is the Dixie Cryptid YouTube podcast, also known as the What If It's True podcast on any podcast app that you're using. Just do a search for Dixie Cryptid or What If It's True podcast on your Apple Podcast app, Spotify, any podcast app you're using. Should be right at the top and you can follow along. I'm going to tell you something about the audio-only podcast. People complain about the ads that run in my videos on YouTube. I have nothing to do with that. I do have a little control. There is a little button when I upload a video that I can place ads, but YouTube never uses it. I spent 4 or 5 years doing that, just placing my own ads, but the ads, if I place 3 in a 1 hour long video, they're still going to put 6. But here's what I want to tell you. If you go to the podcast app, if you look me up on the podcast app, you may have one ad interrupt your listening experience on a podcast app. There are not near as many ads on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker. You can listen on the Spreaker app, Spreaker. You can download all these apps for free. Start an account, doesn't cost you anything. Look up all the podcasts you want to listen to. Look mine up first. And you won't get interrupted with ads. I don't know why people don't use it. I use it all the time. Now, I watch a lot of YouTube, but I only watch that for visual stuff. This podcast is an audio podcast. The stuff you see running on the screen is just stuff I have to put in there simply because YouTube is a visual platform. Anyway, I just wanted to drop that, what do they call them? Hacks. That's an ad hack. Go to Apple Podcast or Spotify, or I use Podbean, the Podbean app. It seems to work really well, but it really doesn't matter. These podcasts are streamed anywhere. So anyway, enough of that. On to the story. I think I've got 6 or 7 in this podcast. I certainly hope you guys enjoy it. So, all right, here we go. When my son was 4, we went north to visit my aunt and uncle. At the time, they lived on a beautiful property spanning 80 acres, not too far from Huntsville, Ontario. My uncle was born and raised in rural Quebec, and he grew up in the woods among the wildlife. Later, as a young man, he lived and worked in logging camps in Ontario and Quebec. Their property was a nature lover's dream. Deer routinely wandered into their backyard along with bears and other wildlife, and a host of other birds and smaller wildlife. It was one of my favorite places to be. On this visit, it was winter, and we were sitting around in their living room as the wood stove chugged out heat and the conversation worked its way around to strange things my uncle had seen and heard in the forest in his lifetime. He began telling a story about a deer hunting trip that he took part in many years prior near North Bay, Ontario. He and his hunting partner had come up dry, and since it was getting dark, they were heading back to the warmth of their lodging and a hot meal. As it was, though, they got somewhat off the beaten path and ended up taking the scenic route. It was dark by that point, and they were cold and miserable, when all of a sudden they heard the sound emanating from the woods that could only be described as an angry monkey scream. My uncle and his buddy froze solid when it went off again, only louder. By this point, they were starting to mentally take inventory of what animals could have made that sound, but they came up empty. They stood there for a minute facing out into the dark woods. The ensuing silence was every bit as scary as the noise they had just heard. They decided not to wait around for an encore and instead to double time it back to their cabin where not one more word was said about this incident. Now, my uncle never once mentioned the word Sasquatch or even hinted at it, but given his location at the time and the sheer ferocity of the sound and the fact that it froze him, a seasoned hunter, in his tracks, I would not discount Sasquatch. In August of 2018, I took my son to visit my aunt and uncle again on their property. While we were there, we had a great time exploring the woods and walking down to the beautiful beach about a mile away. But in typical fashion, my internal clock went into overdrive, and the first day there, I found myself awake at 4 a.m. Well, I figured rather than lie in bed stewing about being awake, I'd go downstairs and do some painting until everyone woke up. This house did not have air conditioning, so they routinely left windows open to create a cross breeze. Between that and the shade from the huge trees all around, the house was always at a nice temperature, even when it was sticky out. And there I was in the dining room table with my watercolors in front of me, beside a huge open window, listening to the birds in the forest as they began to wake and go about their daily routine. Outside, it was washed with a silvery blue pre-dawn light, and except for the birds, everything was quiet. I was painting away happily when all of a sudden I noticed that even the birds had stilled. I thought little of it, and I kept on painting until, in the distance, I heard the distinct sound of wood hitting hard against another piece of wood. My head shot upright, and I listened. There were 3 knocks, and then a pause, and then a couple more, and then a short, distant, lyrical whoop sound that started low and went higher toward the end. No freaking way, I thought to myself. I immediately realized my son would be furious with me if I didn't capture the sounds, so I reached for my cell phone and turned on the video. Even though there was another faint moan in the distance, When I played back the recording, the only audible sound was that of my rather excited breathing. I told my son at breakfast what I'd heard, but he thought I was kidding with him. To this day, I'll never be convinced that what I heard that morning in the twilight was not a Sasquatch. The wood knocking was intentional, and the whooping sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. Keep doing your good work, your non-judgmental approach, and fantastic accent. Oh, make you one of the best on YouTube, and my son and I love your channel, signed Nancy. That was a really nice compliment. Not many people compliment my accent. But I can't change it, and I just roll with it, and there's plenty of people that talk like me, so we go through life not understanding each other. Hey, yak yak. All right, thank you, Nancy, for the story. This was great. Thank you. My encounter occurred in the summer of 1975. I was 13 years old at the time. My cousin Jim and I decided to go camping near my home, located in the southeastern corner of Mecklenburg County in North Carolina, in an area of woods that is known as Colonel Francis Beatty Park. This section of the country was remote in the 1970s with sparse development. The woods, comprising several hundred acres, included a beautiful section where several large creeks converged with a mature section of hardwoods and pines. There's a high-tension power line extending through the eastern corner of this tract, which I now realize may have been the pathway for our visitor. The land was bordered by planted fields on two sides and a road on the other two sides, with some development. Essentially, it was an oasis of hardwoods surrounded by fields. By the age of 13, I was already an accomplished camper, having camped in the wilderness areas for week-long stretches with my father since I was 6. I was accustomed to being in the woods at night, having taken several frog-gigging trips with my father to remote ponds throughout Union County, where we would spend hours tromping around the darkness up to my chest in water. It was not unusual for us to encounter snakes, deer, raccoons, and other wildlife. Jim and I hiked about 2 miles and made camp in a clear area of hardwoods just above a waterfall in the creek in the center of this tract. Accompanying us was my dog, Alicia. She was a German Shepherd who was fiercely loyal and followed me everywhere. Back then, there were no leash laws, and she patrolled my family's 7-acre home site religiously, chasing off all manner of animals. She was accustomed to the wildlife in our area, and it was common for her to wake us up after cornering a possum or a raccoon on our patio late at night. After exploring the area all day, we settled in for the night with a nice fire. Sometime late in the evening, we were both awakened by my dog. Leisha was making a weird combination of noises, sort of a mix of whining and growling. She came in the tent, pacing and cowering between us. She had never done anything like that before, and it baffled me. She could not be consoled. Leisha would bark incessantly at strangers, dogs, or wildlife, or she would chase them off without hesitation. But I had never seen her behave the way that she did that night, nor did I see her act that way again after. As we sat awake pondering what was causing her reaction, there were noises out in the woods. The first one that got our attention was a tree falling. We heard distinctive cracks and then the sound of a massive tree hitting the ground. It was a familiar sound to me because we would push over rotten pine trees and kill pine beetles for the fun. This usually required at least several boys to slowly push a tree at its base until it began to sway and then push into each sway until the momentum caused it to break near the base and fall. It wasn't an easy feat, but we would get it done. Dead or rotten tree fall and living tree fall has distinctively different sounds. When a dead tree falls, the cracking is dry and quick. There is no resistance, but when a healthy tree falls, you hear the moisture in the wood protesting, you hear the tearing of the bark and the trunk resisting as the fibers split. Several of us would never have been able to push over a living tree no matter how hard we tried. The tree we heard was green. It was alive. The sound of hitting the ground was heavy and dense with moisture and shook the earth under our tent. When I heard it break in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, I got a shiver. I knew that whatever had made this happen was something big, and my dog was afraid of it. I shared my concern with Jim, and we began to hear distinctive footfalls in the dry leaves. The footfalls were heavy, and they sounded like a person slowly walking. The footsteps grew fainter. We heard another living tree fall, and then silence. It took some time for my dog to settle down, but she never barked or chased after whatever it was. We did not go to sleep at all after that, and we couldn't wait for daylight to get out of the woods. I still live in this area and frequently travel through that section of woods because it has now been converted into a public park. I have continued to camp and hunt in and around this area for as long as I can remember. That particular area was, for many years prior to the park's establishment, my favorite deer hunting area due to the abundance of the animals. The northern section is surrounded by farmland, and the entire track is intersected by several creeks, which now form a big lake. In all my time in the woods, I have never encountered anything that would explain what we heard that night. I recently became interested in the Bigfoot phenomenon, and I've been researching accounts and folklore. This unusual childhood experience remains vivid, and it is now quite evident to me that Sasquatch explains everything we heard. It is, in my opinion, the only creature that would have had that kind of effect on my German Shepherd, and the only creature that would have had the ability to push over a massive green living tree. I grew up in a small town outskirts of Cincinnati, Ohio. My father and I lived in an old log cabin situated in the middle of the woods. He used to always cut trees for heat in the winter, and on the weekends, I would help him load the truck and whatnot. Our white German Shepherd named Duke was my favorite companion. He was beautiful, and in the winter, he would come busting out of the woods on either side of the trail and look like a majestic wolf. He was my best friend. One day, my father, Duke, and I were walking the creek after a day of swimming when we came up on a set of tracks. I was about 10 years old at that time, and I asked my father if they were Dukes. He said no, they weren't. They were from a feline, probably a big bobcat or something of that nature. Well, I put it out of my mind, and we continued on. I'm not sure how much longer this was, since when you're a kid, time really does fly. But Duke and I were outside of the log cabin playing in the yard, as kids do, when all of a sudden Duke got so close to me that I couldn't walk without tripping over him. That's when I looked up at our long gravel driveway and I saw what made those tracks. It was a massive, 8-foot-long black cat slinking its way from us up the long gravel driveway. I know things seem larger when you're a kid, but this thing really was big. I never saw its face, just its long, slender body and its tail whipping left to right. I know a cat when I see one, just like everyone else in the world does. It had the grace and agility and stealth of an assassin. My German Shepherd was a good size, maybe 80 pounds, but this cat dwarfed him. That's when I realized Duke had saved my life. If I had been out there alone, that cat would have easily killed me. If you search the internet for black panthers living in North America, the answers you will get are that they flat out don't exist here. But I know what I saw. Maybe it was a pet that got too big to keep and was set loose. In the 1980s and 90s, people had a thing for exotic pets and tended to let them loose when they got too big. All I know is that I saw a monster panther that day, and my German Shepherd saved my life. I'll never forget that day. I'll never forget that cat or my dog Duke. Thank you for reading this. Signing off. In 2010, I lived in an old house with a couple of acres and a swamp nearby. It was in southeast Georgia in Bullock County, about an hour northwest of Savannah. There's a ditch between my property and my grandmother's property that's 4 feet deep. Red swamp maple grows on both sides of it, and you wouldn't know it was there unless you're paying attention when you're passing it from the road. It runs in a T from the front of the property back to the swamp behind the house, and then into a vernal pond that dries up every summer. It hadn't rained, so the ditch was dry as a bone. Our family reunion was held at my grandmother's property every April and has been held every year there for 65 years. My brother and I and our families were always last to call it a night. It was getting late when we heard a strange sound outside. One of my brothers said it could have been a screech owl. We left it at that and said our goodbyes, and I headed for bed. I had become disabled the year before, and I used a wheelchair. I could stand, but I couldn't walk far because the cartilage in both of my hips had worn out. I had learned that sleeping on the couch was easier to get out of than getting out of my bed, so I'd taken to sleeping in the living room. I never left any lights on because the windows faced east and west, and the yard light lit up the interior of the house enough for me to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. There were 3 windows in the living room, each 3 feet wide and 5 feet long. These were old windows that my dad had removed and rebuilt and were made of that thin old glass that looks like it's melting. The window that faced west was 5 feet off the ground. That night it was just me and my pug, Blinky, who was then 8 years old. He was a good little watchdog, and he sounded like he was 10 feet tall when he went on alert, even though he only weighed 12 pounds. I had just laid on the couch, and Blinky laid down on the floor beside me. I was almost asleep when all of a sudden an ungodly scream came from the ditch. It sounded like the one my brothers and I had heard earlier, but it was closer and louder and wilder this time. I started to sit up when Blinky sailed up to my chest, knocking my breath out of me and baying like he was a huge dog. He barked for a good 5 minutes. His fur was bristling like I'd never seen before. He wouldn't let me sit up, and he kept jumping onto my chest every time I moved him down to my legs. I found my big flashlight, which I kept between the couch and the cushions, and I shined it out into the swamp maples, shining it back and forth and then up and down the trees. Blinky finally got off me, and I was able to sit up. I turned off the flashlight, and using my furniture as a support, I went into the bathroom with Blinky following me, looking through the window in the bathroom outside, but I couldn't see anything. I was still afraid. That night, Blinky and I slept in my master closet with the interior doors shut tight and locked. I've heard a black panther before. There's one in the Pennsylvania Zoo that screamed right at me, so I knew what I heard wasn't a panther. We had bobcats and foxes on the farm, and it wasn't either of them. We don't have porcupines, and raccoons and possums don't scream like what I heard that night. I don't know what Blinky and I heard, but I've never been so scared in all my life. Blinky passed away in my arms in 2016 at 13 years old, and I moved to the Arizona desert last year. There are no trees here, and that means that there's nowhere for any large animals or mystery creatures to hide, or so I'm told. Now I just have to be aware of rattlesnakes, tarantulas, and bark scorpions. Oh, that was a great story, but I'm so sad about your pug, Blinky. We have a little pug. Her name is Lily. Oh my gosh, I love that dog. She's a stinky little thing, and she's a snorty snorter. You know how pugs are. They're just little footballs, and their faces are all alien-like. You ever looked in a pug's mouth? They have the weirdest skull structure of any dog I've ever seen. But it's one of the oldest breeds in human history. I think they come out of China, but I want to just tell y'all, if anybody's looking for a family pet, a pug is the absolute best family pet you can buy. I love labs. I have a little pit bull mix. We have a hairless Mexican Terrier. He's a great dog. And all of our dogs are good, but that pug, she may or may not be my favorite. But if you're looking for just a family pet, a dog that's good with kids, that's a lap dog, that's lovable. I mean, their faces are shaped so that they just can't hardly bite you. They're a great dog to raise with a family. So anyway, that's my dog advice for the day. Thank you to the writer for this story. I thought it was good. Thanks. In July of 2009, I moved to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, to begin graduate studies in the biology program at Middle Tennessee State University. It was during the tail end of a recession, and I had been working for a surveyor who could only pay me for 3 days a week, so I didn't have a lot of money. I drove around downtown Murfreesboro and was overtaken by a nostalgic mood. This quiet, old downtown neighborhood and the tree-lined streets leading up to the old courthouse on the square was where I had lived 10 years prior to this. I ran these old streets in the fall of 1999 with their turning leaves, the orange and yellow of the sugar maples leading up to the square. I would be attending Navy Officers Candidate School at the beginning of the next year, and I wanted to get in shape. A decade later, I had come to take advantage of the educational opportunity my service had afforded me. I saw a for rent sign at an old building on Lytle Street, just a block from the campus. I walked into the open front door. There was an apartment on either side. I walked up the creaky wooden stairs to find 2 more apartments up top. The door stood wide open to one of them. It was dirty. Animal feces was on the floor. A large old window was open, letting in the 90-degree air. While this could have been a sign to run away, to me it was a sign that the rent might be cheap. I called the number on the sign out front and was told to drive up the street to the owner's law office and sign the rental agreement. I chose apartment 3, upstairs across the hall from the one I had walked into on my initial visit. It had just been repainted and the floors were swept. A small air conditioner did what it could do to cool the large rooms with the old drafty windows. But I didn't mind the heat. Too much air conditioning in the summer has always given me chills. Some friends helped me move my belongings down from Nashville. Everything I owned at the time could be carried in 2 loads in the bed of my Ford Ranger pickup truck. I settled into my new apartment, and in a couple of weeks classes began and I enjoyed being back on college campus. Pretty girls, thought-provoking conversation, not being on a tight workday schedule. There was a learning curve also. As a graduate student, I had earned extra money teaching biology labs. I had forgotten statistics, and my first lab found me teaching students about the t-test, which I did not recall having ever heard before this lab. Incidentally, it was invented by the head brewmaster at Guinness in the early 1900s as a way to do a statistical quality control on batches of that fine stout. Some days I would walk back home between classes and take a nap. I've always been a napper, but rarely do I fall into a deep sleep, definitely not enough to enter a dream state. I was surprised to suddenly be awakened by a loud whistle, sharp like when someone puts their thumb and finger in the edge of their mouth and really blows. I looked outside and saw that the school 2 doors down was letting out, and cars lined up the street waiting to pick up their children. Other kids were running down the sidewalk. Shortly after this, I was asleep one night when again I was awakened by that whistle. I rose up and the only sound in the room was a steady hum of my fan. I looked out the open window by my bed, but I didn't see anyone walking around in the darkness. The hair on the back of my neck stood up a little, and I didn't sleep well for the rest of that night. A short time later, I was out in the front yard smoking a cigarette and talking with my neighbor. She, with her husband and daughter, lived in apartment 1 downstairs. The other 2 apartments were still empty as I recall. Now, this doesn't have much to do with the story, but I believe it bears pointing out that she was a witch. She always wore black, but this being Murfreesboro, goth was always in style. But one day I had seen her and her husband walking across the backyard, slowly, ceremoniously. Her husband was a normal enough ponytail guy who worked at the Bunny bread plant in town, or maybe it was Pillsbury, I can't remember. It's irrelevant. She carried a round mirror with a candle and a pentagram made from dried weeds on top of it. They walked to the dilapidated woodshed out back, and hours later, I walked out and found the mirror and pentagram of weeds. It was still sitting in that shed when my girlfriend and I moved out to our apartment several years later. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I was out talking with my neighbor who was sitting in the arm of a dogwood tree on an overcast November day. After general pleasantries, she asked me if I had ever experienced anything strange in the house. No, not really, I said. Why do you ask? Just wondering, she said. I was about to walk back inside when I said, there is one thing I think is strange. You get the whistle, don't you? She said. Suddenly a shudder ran over me. Yeah, I said. My daughter gets the whistle too, she said. She's learned to ignore it. We sat about talking some more, and we talked about supposed haunted houses in downtown Murfreesboro. My neighbor told me about one house she had heard about with a child's handprints that couldn't be painted over. She heard that they just kept bleeding back through. Oh, that's creepy, I said, and then walked back inside. Either that night or the next, I was sitting on the hardwood floor in my living room working on a project for a class. Not having an overhead light, I had set the lamp in the floor next to me so I could see while I glued leaves and stems to some thick paper. The light at this low angle cast the room in a new perspective, and looking up, I saw it. In the corner, on the wall next to the kitchen door, were two small handprints. It appeared to be two right hand prints from a child, and my jaw dropped. I ran down to my neighbor's apartment and got her and her husband to walk up. I didn't tell them what for, I just said, "You're not going to believe this." My neighbor reacted as expected with a string of expletives signifying incredulous surprise. They walked back downstairs still dumbfounded by the prints on the wall. I finished my work for the night and I went to bed, and I rationalized the handprints as being from a child who had left an indelible mark in a workman's fresh plaster many years ago. Well, time went on, and I would occasionally show the handprints to friends who came over to the house. A curiosity in an old house that would elicit a reaction of creepy surprise, but little more. I also don't remember getting the whistle anymore by this time. A year later, in November of 2010, I was taking a course in statistics and had a mild romantic interest in a pretty girl in the class. She came over one evening before test to study. I heated up some frozen chicken nuggets and we sat on my bed studying and watching TV. After a while, we got tired of studying and just talked for a while. I poured her a glass of wine and I had a beer, and around 11 o'clock, she went home. I took her wine glass and I set it on the counter by the sink, and I went to bed. I woke up sometime in the night and walked to the kitchen to get a drink of water, and there it was. The wine glass sat upright on the kitchen floor, 8 or 10 feet from the sink, in the middle of the doorway where the handprints were. Now, maybe I was preoccupied with my date that evening, but for whatever reason, I didn't think anything of it. I was just glad the glass hadn't broken. The next morning, I got up and made my oatmeal, heating up the water in a little red camping cup. After eating, I washed my travel mug for coffee, and I sat on the counter and began washing my spoon and bowl. The travel mug fell off the counter, somehow traveling halfway across the kitchen. It struck me as odd, but Then again, things could easily fall off a rounded edge of an old enameled countertop if placed too close to the edge. So I walked on to class with my coffee in hand. I think I had to teach labs that day because I didn't come back until 4 or 4:30 that afternoon. As I walked up the sidewalk, Levi, who lived downstairs, and our friend Jason were sitting on the porch drinking a beer. Over the course of that day, I had thought about the wine glass being moved across the kitchen and, to some extent, my coffee mug flying across the counter. I told them what had happened and was met with the "dude, that's weird" reactions that I had expected. I sang a few bars of the Twilight Zone theme and then suggested that we go up to the Boro and get some beers. They agreed that was a good idea, so I walked upstairs to drop off my backpack, and my jaw dropped and chills ran all over my body when I walked in the door. The little red cup that I had heated water in that morning was now sitting in the kitchen doorway, exactly where the wine glass had sat the night before. I ran back downstairs and I got my buddies to come up. We all looked at each other in disbelief. And then we walked back downstairs and went to the bar. I don't recall if it was later that evening or the next, but Levi and I were sitting up in my apartment. It may have been the same evening because I remember I was a little scared to be there by myself. I sat at my desk, which was right beside the kitchen door, right across from the handprints. Levi stood in the kitchen doorway. We drank beer and talked about girls and guitars and songwriting and our usually topics of conversation. But we also talked about the unexplainable events of the last 24 hours. And that's when I saw it move. A metal yardstick was leaning up in the corner where the handprints were, 5 feet from where I sat. I looked in the corner, and the yardstick began to shake vigorously. I grabbed Levi and pointed to the corner. The yardstick shook for a couple of more seconds, and then it stopped. At this point, the kitchen door, which was always open, slammed on Levi's back and shoulder. We looked at each other because this was just too odd. But as soon as he pushed the door back, it slammed again. I don't recall for sure, but it may have slammed a third time. We both stood in the doorway, jumping and leaning hard into the door, trying to make it close again, just to see if Levi could have jarred the door, causing it to close. We never got it to move. After a while, Levi went downstairs to go to bed because he had to go to work the next morning. I crawled into my bed, but sleep was hard to come by. The next day, I was talking to a girl who sat next to me in my medicinal plants class, and I told her about the strange events that I had experienced. She told me that this sounded like a spirit that was about to manifest itself, and it could be in a terrifying form. Well, this was not encouraging since I thought perhaps this was just a friendly ghost. She suggested that I burn sage to clean the house. Without going into a long sidetrack as to why, I'll just say that I already had a bundle of sage in the house. I went home that evening and sat on the front porch with Levi's roommate, who was named Mike. After a beer, we walked upstairs and we lit the sage. Only the kitchen light was on. I don't recall why I didn't turn on any of the other lamps. I walked through the apartment with the sage, making up a cleansing ritual as I went. "There's nothing but love here," I said. "I bring nothing but love, but I live here. I pay rent. You don't belong here." And then Mike interjected, "But if you're here, show yourself." No, I never want to see you. I have nothing but love, but you need to go wherever you're supposed to go. I pay the rent here," I continued to say. Afterwards, Mike went back downstairs, and I sat alone in the apartment, and the aroma of the sage strong throughout the rooms. I went to bed that night and slept well. I slept well from then on. There were no other ghostly occurrences. Those events so many years ago left me with a good ghost story to tell, but the event has also left me with something more. When someone I love passes away and friends and family attempt to comfort us by talking about the afterlife, I tell them, "I know." We live on past our earthly bodies. I don't say this based on faith. I know it from experience. I learned that ghosts are real on Lytle Street on those overcast November days many years ago. The building still stands with its quadruplex of apartments, creaky wooden floors and stairs, but it has been completely renovated now with modern windows that keep out cold drafts and modern cabinets and countertops. No one I know lives there any longer, but I would like to stop by one afternoon and strike up a conversation. I want to ask, do you ever hear a strange whistle at night? All right, I'm going to drop a archive or two behind this for people who may not have heard these older stories. I'll say now, thank you for joining me on this podcast, and I appreciate you, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks. Growing up, I had many spiritual encounters. I spent most of my young life absolutely terrified. I've often thought of writing a book about all the experiences I've had, but I learned very quickly to keep them to myself. Once I finally moved out of the house and grew up, the experiences stopped. None of those experiences pertained to Bigfoot. They were all centered on ghosts and spirits. I'm 36 years old now, and to this day I'm still terrified of the dark. I removed every closet door in my house the day we closed on it. I'm not ashamed to say that I still have to sleep with a night light on in my room, the bathroom light on, and the light over the stove on unless it burns out. If it gets dark outside and there's still laundry to be hung, I leave it until the next morning. And I'm grateful for my husband. I've told him everything, and whether or not he believes me, I'll never know. But he's never laughed at me or told me that I'm crazy, and nor has he ever made me think he doesn't believe me. He's very understanding of my needs when it comes to the closet doors and such. As for Bigfoot, I had never thought about it. Nobody ever talked about it while I was growing up, so it never crossed my mind until a few years ago when I stumbled across a Bigfoot Encounter podcast. Immediately, I became obsessed, utterly and completely obsessed. I believe all of them. I know what it's like to experience something and not be believed, and it really sucks. Now I've watched all the shows and documentaries and encounter stories. Last week, my husband and I took our boys, who were also obsessed with Bigfoot, by the way, on vacation to the panhandle of Florida. It was the middle of nowhere, and it was pure bliss to visit the springs and the beaches that we hadn't been before. We were driving down the road with no houses around, there were no other cars, and there wasn't any cell service, and there was nothing for miles and miles when my husband turned around to face the back seat so he could talk to the boys about something. I was driving and staring at the road ahead of us when I saw this massive, unbelievably large thing dart across the road a few hundred yards in front of me. It was too far ahead for us to get any details, but I knew immediately what it was. It was so enormous, but it moved so fast. And the way it moved, I knew it was a Bigfoot. I immediately yelled for everyone to look, but it was moving so quickly that neither my husband nor my boys were able to see it. And by the time we got to the place in the road where it had crossed, it was nowhere to be found. The woods are thick there, and it was as if they had swallowed it up. It had completely vanished. I know this wasn't the best of encounters, but I like to think that it was God's way of blessing me with a tiny glimpse of what is really out there. I've been dreaming excessively about it since that day. It replays over and over in my head. My husband and my oldest son, who was 8, were disappointed they didn't get to see it too, but I feel grateful. I've spent the last few years in the woods hoping for an encounter, and I finally got one. My father was the second youngest of 10 kids. He and his twin sister were born in 1945 at their family home in Clay, West Virginia. He grew up being called Buckshot, and until I was 9 or 10 years old, I thought that was his Christian name. Although he passed away in 2017, he told a story many times before he died. My brother was with him when it happened, and he has never discredited a word of my dad's story, so I have no doubt that this story is true. In 1978, when my brother Phil was 11, Dad said, "Come on, boy, it's time. You're going to go on your first raccoon hunt." Our father's love for raccoon hunting was infectious, so Phil was tickled to death to be joining him for the first time. They put on their coal miners' light helmets and strapped the battery packs to their waists, and they headed out. The only one more excited for the hunt that night than my brother was my dad's favorite dog. He was a walker named Pretty Boy. Whenever he saw Dad getting ready, he always started panting and barking and dancing around his legs. He knew they were going hunting, and he couldn't wait to see the tailgate drop on my dad's 1976 Chevy Love truck so he could load up. That night, my dad and brother drove 20 miles to his friend Rick's place. Rick had several dogs of his own, along with 2 teenage sons who also hunted. They decided where they'd be going, and they set out as it was getting dark. They knew they'd have good luck that night because the farmer who lived there had been complaining about the raccoons getting into his feed bins. With their good quality hunting dogs and their own skills, they were sure to be able to relieve the farmer of at least a few of those pests. Dad, Rick, and the boys walked the dogs out on leashes, located a scent trail, and turned them loose. After that, it was only a matter of time before the dogs treed. Until then, all they had to do was settle in near their trucks and wait and listen. It didn't take long. Within 15 minutes, the dogs had treed. My dad said they were real close. They turned on their lights and started up the mountains towards the sound of the dogs. They had to cross a barbed wire fence, but they found the dogs at the base of a large beech tree. In West Virginia, these trees, with their pale, almost white bark, can grow to massive proportions. It can take 3 men with their arms stretched wide to reach around the circumference of one. Because of the tree's size and the fact that it still had branches of dead leaves here and there, they thought they might have difficulty seeing the raccoon. But once the dogs were leashed and pulled away from the tree, however, they discovered they'd have no trouble spotting what the hounds had treed. But it wasn't a raccoon. Sitting up on the branches of the tree, covered in reddish-brown hair, was a young Sasquatch. It was 6 feet tall, and Dad described it as looking like a tall, skinny orangutan with a face like a man. It looked down on them with glowing red eyes and bared its big square teeth and sharp canines at them. That's when it screamed, and it hit them in the chest like a Mack truck. Phil and the other 2 boys fell to the ground and began to cry. Rick stood frozen in place, and he was unable to move. The dogs cowered in submission, but Pretty Boy managed to crawl over to where Phil was, and he laid across him. A second later, an answering scream came from somewhere in the distance, followed by another one that sounded like it was a mile or so away. That was what shook my dad back to reality. He pushed Pretty Boy off of Phil and helped him to his feet before punching Rick in the arm and saying, "Let's get the heck out of here." "Yeah, let's," Rick answered as he helped the boys up off the ground. "Let's go." Their dogs led them down the mountain as they all hightailed it back to the woods. They were only about halfway there when they heard something behind them come crashing through the woods. It sounded like a bulldozer following them. At that point, Dad picked up Phil like a football and broke into a dead run. He cleared the 3-strand barbed wire fence and didn't stop until he reached the truck. The dogs were there waiting for them. Whatever had chased them down the mountain never caught up with them, but stayed just close enough to keep them motivated. From the top of the mountain came another screaming sound. Daddy thought it had to be a second one, but they weren't going to hang around to find out. He loaded my brother and his dog into the front of his truck, while Rick loaded the boys and dogs into theirs, and they all sped off. Dad headed straight for home and didn't stop until he got there. For him and my brother, it was the end of a harrowing experience. For Rick and his family, however, it was just the beginning. Dad and Phil had a 20-mile drive to make, and Rick and his boys lived a short 7 miles away. As soon as he got home, he told his wife all about what happened that night. They'd been home about 30 minutes, and Rick was still trying to gain control of his heart rate when the same screams they'd heard up on the mountain started coming from the woods behind their barn, about 100 yards from the house. Rick's wife was furious. "You brought those things here. I've got babies in this house, and you brought those things here?" And she yelled at him, "Get rid of them now!" Rick sent her and the kids upstairs with the warning not to come down no matter what she might hear. He then walked around their farmhouse and secured all the doors and windows. As the screams got closer, rocks the size of baseballs began landing on the tin roof. Soon something was walking around the house with heavy stomps that shook their antique hutch and rattled the china plates that were a gift from his wife's granny. He'd brought the dogs inside with him when they got home, but they were hiding under the bed and were of no use. Every 10 minutes or so, something slapped the side of the house or tapped on the window. Rick's nerves had just about reached their limit when he heard his wife screaming from upstairs. He ran up to find her pointing at the window in near hysterics. "I saw a face in that window," she claimed, but that was impossible. That window was 12 feet off the ground. "Call the law," she pleaded. "Do you think they're going to believe me when I tell them we have a 12-foot peeping Tom outside our window?" Rick reasoned with her. "They'll lock us up." After his wife screamed, there were no more sounds from outside. They were all able to get the kids settled down and into bed, but Rick and his wife stayed up the rest of the night. Once the sun came up, he went outside and walked around the house. Then he went back inside and he called buckshot. My dad got there as quickly as he could. He had his Winchester .270, his .357 pistol, and Rick grabbed his 12-gauge Remington, and together they went around the house, the barn, and the perimeter fence. They found rocks on the low side of the roof and footprints all around the house. The largest of the tracks measured 24 inches long and 10 inches across with 5 toes. Where those prints stood under the upstairs window, they sank 3 inches into the ground. "That must have been our peeping Tom, you reckon?" said Rick. Another set of prints measured 16 inches long and 8 inches across, but they only had 4 toes. The third set was smaller, still at 12 inches, and they only had 4 toes too. Rick and Dad estimated the smallest set must have been the one their dogs had treed, while the middle-sized set must have been the mother, and the largest set belonged to the daddy, or the alpha male. Within the week, Rick and his wife moved to North Carolina, where her family lived, but he and my dad remained friends over the years. And by the way, the place they were hunting that night, it's called Booger Holler.